Afternoon. I'm going to give everybody just a couple of minutes to come in before I start my introductory spiel. So welcome. Thank you for coming today. If you're joining us by Zoom, comment in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from. We've never asked people to do this before, but I'm always kind of curious. So let me know where you're watching from. So thank you guys for joining us for another episode or installment of Chat with Green Aggies. We are going to talk about POA a lot today. I believe we are also going to be talking about columbines today. Yes? Is that the plan? Awesome. So I'm very excited about that. Glad to have you guys here with us to talk about these things. POA is a pretty timely topic because we're really starting to see it. We've been seeing it germinate and emerge actually for a while. We have a site where we observed that down in College Station, and we noticed the first germination and emergence back in September, actually, because we had a little cold flush there. Some of it's going to be determined by how much vegetative coverage you have. So the plots where we monitor it are bare, which means they're more exposed to the elements and they don't have a competition from turf. And so we saw it probably a little earlier in those plots, but certainly it's up and running now. I'm still mostly in my yard seeing rescue grass. I haven't seen a lot of POA really stand out yet. What about you guys?
I haven't noticed too much POA yet. But I think our Dallas-Fort Worth area rescue grass must be its signature winter grass, I think.
Yes.
Think we have a lot of rescue grass.
Yes, my backyard is a nice rescue grass yard during the winter time. And it actually looks really good if you keep it mowed. I mean,
Eating that fescue. I just mow my rescue grass and it looks great.
What about down in Houston, Paul? Are y'all seeing any of these winter annuals coming up yet?
Not yet. The slender aster, we're seeing a lot of that. But on the grass side, not a whole heck of a lot yet. So, we've gotten cool and then we're warm again. And so I think this weekend we're supposed to get cool again. So who knows? We'll see what happens. One of these weeks it'll show up. So
I thought you were always cool.
That I am. You got that right.
Okay, so
hot and humid.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen here and we'll get started with the presentation for today. Much ado about POA. This is what we're going to talk about today is this little weed here on the left. And we'll talk about why are we only talking about this one weed, and we'll get into that a little bit today. So first thing I wanted to start off with was what are we talking about when I say POA? So other terms that you may see used in reference to this particular weed, the scientific name or what we're typically referring to when we talk about POA, particularly in a weed management, from a weed management standpoint, is going to be Poa annua. And there are a number of other types of POA that are out there, other species of POA, like Poa supina, Poa trivialis. But for today's purposes, we're going to be talking about Poa annua. Common name for this is going to be annual bluegrass. You may also hear people call it poana, which is kind of the southern twist on that Poa annua scientific name. As my counterpart, Chrissy Seegers, likes to say, this is probably the only weed that we commonly call by its scientific name, or at least its genus. So he's also kind of a resident bad boy of turfgrass weeds. We'll talk about some instances in which people choose to grow Poa on purpose, but a lot of times, particularly in turfgrass and other managed landscape systems, this is an especially challenging weed. It's very adaptable. We see a lot of diversity in it, and it's part of why we're focusing in on it today. So here's a little bit of background on the physical characteristics of this weed, which can be useful for identification purposes. A lot of times we may mix up Poa with other winter annual grasses. And so making sure that we have a plan for how to properly identify it, particularly if we are professionals and we're working to manage it. This is going to be a winter annual grass, which means it germinates in the fall, typically when our soil temperatures reach around 70 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 to 5 consecutive days. And its life cycle kind of progresses over the winter months. And then as our temperatures warm back up the following spring, we'll see it start to burn out and die back. Now, It has what we call a bunch type growth habit, which means it has the ability to tiller, and it forms a nice little clump just like we see here, okay? But it's not gonna spread out with rhizomes and stolons the way that some of our turf grasses that we're more familiar with may do, a Bermuda grass, St. Augustine grass, or even some of our challenging perennial grass weeds have that capacity. Dallas grass, for example, has the ability to spread by rhizomes. But this particular grass, it doesn't do that. It doesn't spread laterally in that way. Instead, it survives through a combination of extreme adaptability and prolific seed production. So we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. You'll also see where it says life cycle, it says perenniating biotypes. So what that means is that we may see in some cases this weed functions more like a perennial instead of an annual. And we have many weeds that may do something similar depending on the climate conditions that we're in. If we look at the physical characteristics of this particular grassy weed, a couple things to note. The first is that the leaf tip is boat shaped, so you can see a nice little example of that over here on the left-hand side in this photo. The auricles are absent, so if you're not familiar with auricles, if I go in and I look at the juncture where the leaf blade meets the stem, auricles can occur right there at the collar, right at that juncture, and they may protrude around the stem and be distinctive in their own right. So an example of a winter annual grass that does have distinctive long and clasping auricles is going to be annual ryegrass. But in the case of Poa or annual bluegrass, we don't see those auricles. However, we do see a ligule. So if you look in this picture on the left-hand side, over here on your screen, you'll see this little flap of what looks like kind of a little piece of skin almost. And this is what we refer to as the auricle. So if I were to peel this leaf blade back, I would see that, and we refer to it as long and membranous. Some grasses may have no auricle. Some grasses may have a hairy auricle. The length of that auricle may vary. The shape of it may vary. And all of those things can help us distinguish between different grass species. So in the case of Poa, no auricles, and we do have a ligule. We also see here it says vernation is folded. So this has to do with how the leaves are basically arranged within the bud. So if I were to take a cross section of the stem, folded vernation means that we're going to see this kind of folded cupping in that cross section, as opposed to rolled, where it's going to look more spiral. Now, depending on how small and fine the grass is, this can be a lot harder to see in some grasses than others. And in the case of the inflorescence or the flower, we're going to see this spikelet in terminal panicle-like arrays, like you see in this bottom photo over here on the left. So as I indicated, Poa annua germinates in the fall. Typically, we see our first flush when soil temperatures drop to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If you've been joining us for other presentations lately, you've probably heard me allude to the fact that Poa annua can have a second flush of germination, or it can continue to germinate well into the winter months. And so it's not like we get this one single flush in the fall, and then after that, nothing else new comes up. It really depends on the climate conditions, the soil moisture and temperatures that we're seeing in our particular region. It survives very, very low mowing heights. So if you're familiar with golf environments, if you play golf, you're familiar with how short those greens are. And this is a very common greens weed. So we will see it at these very, very low mowing heights. Produces pretty unsightly panicles, panicle type inflorescences in the spring that can be, if you're trying to maintain a manicured turf area in particular, this can be a visual distraction, something that people don't like. And it can produce over 2,000 seeds per plant. So again, this lends itself to the spreading and the proliferation of this weed that does not spread by other manners like those rhizomes or stolons. So here's some fun facts about Poa to share with you. The first is that this was thought to have originated from a hybrid of Poa infirma and Poa supina approximately 2.5 million years ago. So it's been around a long time in the interglacial ice ages of Europe. So anytime you're feeling very frustrated with Poa annua, you can just blame Europe. Europe is responsible for this weed being created. I'm just kidding. Don't blame Europe, okay? It could have happened anywhere. But it is acclimated to a colder climate. It is what we call a C3 plant, a C3 grass, okay? So it's going to be, that's why it tends to thrive during our colder months, and it's not able to survive our warmer months. Here's a nice fun fact Laura and I were talking about before the program started today. This weed is found on all 7 continents. So that really speaks to its love of travel. It likes to go and set up shop anywhere it possibly can. And this includes Antarctica. So this was a paper that came out a few years ago looking at Poa annua populations in the maritime regions of Antarctica. And they're seeing increasingly that it's pushing deeper and deeper into the tundra and into the colder regions of Antarctica. So it's able to set up shop just about anywhere and give anybody a little bit of a headache. Now, we do have some instances in which Poa annua is a desired grass. Now, not really here in the state of Texas. We are just too warm. It doesn't look like this when we try to grow it here on purpose. Anybody that's joining us in the Zoom, does anybody know what golf course this is? You can chime in the chat, see if you guys can figure out what course this is. This is a pretty big course, pretty famous course. It's out in California. So this is Pebble Beach. This is Pebble Beach. And so they actually have Poa annua greens and they look pretty good, right? Unfortunately, you know, here in Texas, we end up getting something that looks more like this. This is a real picture that I took of a golf course that shall not be named, where it kind of looks like somebody dropped a Poa bomb on this green. So you can see all these little Poa plants that have come up. And when you're trying to putt on that, it's akin to trying to play Plinko, right? You're trying to get that ball around all of those little weeds and get it into the hole. So definitely, if I'm a golf course superintendent, this is not something that I want to have on my golf course. It's something that I'm going to put a lot of time and effort and money into avoiding if I can. So why are we talking about this one weed today? Why aren't we talking more broadly about all the winter weeds? Well, in a 2015 survey conducted by the Weed Science Society of America, which is WSSA, Poa annua was identified as the most troublesome weed in managed turf grass systems throughout the United States. It has a very high level of genetic diversity and an ability to adapt rapidly to different climates and management programs. So we will see that this weed has the capacity to develop resistance within a very short period of just a few years, depending on how products are being used at that facility. So if I'm a landscape or turf grass manager, that's very concerning to me to learn that using a product that I really like over just a few years can mean that that product stops working for me. It's also ranked 3rd among all herbicide-resistant weeds globally. This is a weed with a lot of resistance issues. So this is from the International Survey of Herbicide-Resistant Weeds. You can get on there and learn about resistant weed populations all over the world and which sites of action those weeds are going to be resistant to. Poa annua has been identified. We've seen resistance to at least 9 herbicide sites of action. This is the term that's being used now more commonly in the weeds world instead of modes of action. So 9 different larger groups of herbicides that we have seen Poa develop resistance to. So that's kind of scary. We're currently doing a very big project with multiple institutions here, which I'll share with you guys here in a little bit, where we're doing a broad spectrum screening of Poa annua populations all across the country. We have about 1,500 populations that we've done a screening on, and in some of those cases, as we dig deeper into them, we're potentially seeing that a single population can be resistant to several modes of action. So imagine, trying to choose a herbicide product to control this weed at your facility, and you have right out of the gate, a handful of herbicide groups that just aren't going to work for you. So that's something that can be really alarming. We see that, landscape professionals, turf grass professionals, can spend a lot of money trying to combat this particular weed and trying to overcome resistance issues. So what is herbicide resistance? A lot of times when we think about resistance or when we think about pests, a lot of times the first thing that comes to mind for people is insects, right? We think pests, we think insects, we might think pathogens. A lot of times weeds aren't really thought about by people in terms of being part of this larger group of pests. But we do, weeds are pests. We do use pesticides to manage them. We call these herbicides. And similarly with any other pest group, if I mismanage my use of those products and I'm not handling them properly, I'm not using them properly, I'm going to open the door up to have a resistance issue with my weed populations the way that I would with any other pest population where I'm using chemical control products. So the way that this typically, well, let me define herbicide resistance first. So we define this as the inherited ability of an individual plant to survive a herbicide application that would kill a normal population of the same species. So in other words, you go out there with your bottle of, your jug of Roundup and you spray it on these Poa plants, and let's say 9 out of 10 of them are controlled by this product. And then that last one is just like, haha, you didn't get me, okay? Then that particular plant is going to continue to produce seed and spread throughout your population until you have a large portion of the weeds in that population are now resistant to that particular product, whatever it is, okay? So there are a number of things that can contribute to this. We'll talk about this more, but repeated use of the same herbicides with the same site of action will select for resistant plants, okay? These uncontrolled plants will reproduce. This leads to an increased prevalence of resistance within a local population. So here again, I've got my one plant that's resistant, okay? It survives and sets seeds. Now I have multiple plants in my population that are resistant, and this is going to keep growing until a significant portion of that population may be resistant to a particular site of action. Now these populations can then move off site. You can move them around from one area to another on lawnmowers or other pieces of equipment. We also will see that resistant populations can be introduced or taken off site just with shoes. Poa seed happily sticks to the bottom of your shoes. And we actually see some really high-end golf courses, they may require you to wash your shoes before going out to play on their facility in order to prevent you from accidentally tracking in something from another course from the last time you played. So there are a number of common missteps or misconceptions that can contribute to the risk of herbicide resistance in a facility. The first, of course, is going to be the overuse of herbicide products. Okay, so whether it's because we're relying too much on chemical control as a whole, or we're relying too much on a particular product, a lot of times we may use a product one time and see that it's very effective and it fits within our budget and it just seems like a good fit. And then we just use that product every single time. And gradually over time, we may see that that product no longer works for us because we've really kind of abused it to the point of not being effective. Here's something that also happens a lot of times is there's a misconception around what it means to rotate. You probably heard this term, rotate your modes of action or rotate your sites of action. So when I'm thinking about, in this case, a herbicide product, a lot of people may think, okay, this product is no longer working for me, so I'm going to switch my active ingredients around. So one example I like to give is, here's, for example, let's say that I really like to use Revolver, which is form sulfuron, okay? And I see that Revolver works really well for me, and I wanna make sure that I mix something else in with it, rotate something else in with it with my chemical program so that I don't develop a resistance issue with Revolver. Well, then I may choose, okay, well, what's something that I know is going to work similarly, but it's got a different chemical in it. And I might choose something like Monument or trifloxysulfuron. Well, the problem with that is that even though those are two different active ingredients and different products, they have the same site of action. They're both ALS inhibitors. They're both classified as a group 2 herbicide, which means if all I'm doing is switching back and forth between those two products, I'm not necessarily preventing a potential resistance issue from occurring. So I have to bring something in from a different herbicide group with a different site of action in order to help have this good management practice. And you're able to do that once we kind of close out of this PowerPoint. I'll pull up the example of a label. And the label very clearly will tell you what group a product is classified into or which groups if there's multiple active ingredients in there. And so you can look at your labels and choose products that have a different group number to help you with your rotation of modes of action. The other thing that can contribute to herbicide resistance issues in a facility is going to be experimentation with application rates and or timing, particularly off-label experimentation. So, the label is the law. Be very, very clear about that. And a lot of work goes into that label and determining which rates are appropriate, what timing is appropriate. And sometimes, we are having issues trying to make something work with our budget. We're having issues trying to make something work in terms of efficacy. And so we start experimenting a little bit with trying something at a lower rate, but a higher frequency, or trying something, this product's designed and labeled for pre-emergent control, but I'm going to come out here and I'm going to try to use it as a post-emergent product. Well, when we do that and we go against the label, we're going to substantially increase the risk of herbicide resistance developing with these populations. You can kind of, sometimes I'll tell people it's kind of, when the doctor will tell you, make sure you finish all of these antibiotics. Don't just do the first 4 days and then stop, because it can lead to a superbug. It's kind of a similar concept here. If I'm using an insufficient rate, it's going to increase the likelihood that I have, encourage the proliferation of weeds that are more resistant to this product. Okay, so we always want to follow the label with respect to rate. We always want to follow the label with respect to timing. We always want to respect use restrictions on that product. We don't want to put on our scientist cap and try to go out and experiment on our own, because we may end up creating a pretty significant resistance issue. Not to mention the fact that when we misuse a product, we also increase the likelihood of environmental concerns and health risk concerns as well. So stick to the label. The label is the law. Don't play around with that. So if we're looking at a typical management timeline for Poa annua, again, typically our first pre-emergence application is we're going to want to put that out when our soil temperatures do drop for the first time to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 or 5 consecutive days. Another way to think about this is when our ambient temperatures hit around 75 for 4 or 5 consecutive days. As Paul indicated, we may have a week of those, and then we may have 2 weeks of 90 degrees, and then we may have a week of 40 degrees, and then we may have, so it can make it a little hard to nail down. But certainly what we did see this year is we had, about a week of low temperatures and pretty early on, and it did lead to an initial flush of germination and emergence of some of these winter annual weeds. And so if you didn't get out there in that window and get that pre-emergent out, you may have some extra winter annuals that you had hoped to avoid. So making that first application then is going to be really critical. And then again, we may see that we get a second flush or continued germination later in the season, depending on our climate conditions. And the two big drivers for Poa germination are going to be soil moisture and soil temperature. So a lot of people may ask me, well, what is the appropriate week or month or whatever to put out my pre-emergent product? And we've talked about this on here before. These weeds are not sitting in the soil with a little calendar waiting for a specific day to come along where they can pop out, right? It all is very dependent on the environmental conditions and the soil moisture and temperature conditions that we're seeing. And those can vary significantly from year to year and from region to region, depending on where we are geographically. So Laura's shared on here before, and maybe she'll be my good co-pilot and put on here the greencast so people can kind of find a source where they can kind of keep an eye on these soil temperatures throughout the year. You can also purchase a soil thermometer and track some of that yourself, or you can try to, guess off of some of these ambient temperatures that we're seeing. A lot of times, in terms of preventative, our first pre-emergent application here in Texas, we're going to be looking at sometime, mid to late August, potentially for North Texas, moving into September as we continue to move further towards Central Texas. And then a lot of times when we're talking about South Texas, we can potentially wait until early to mid-October, depending on the season, to put out that first round. And it is kind of a balancing act, because if we put it out too early, a lot of that the activity of that product may be gone before we get really the first big flushes of germination. But if we put it out too late, then we're going to really miss our opportunity for that product to be effective. In terms of that second application, follow label recommendations. Typically, there's going to be an 8 to 10 week reapplication interval. It'll be specific on the bag. You can choose, or on the product label, you can choose to, depending on the product, look at what your options are. Some products will allow you to make 2 complete applications, sequential applications at a set interval where you're using a full rate. Some products you may not be able to do that without exceeding the maximum annual use rate, and in that case they may have a recommendation for a split application program where you kind of divide that rate in half and apply half here and half there. So you'll just want to pay attention to the label and look at what it recommends for those sequential applications. Post-emergence control for POA, we really want to try to get it fairly early in the season when the plant is in a more juvenile vegetative stage. As it continues to mature and it starts to flower and set seed, we see that many of these products may lose a lot of their efficacy on controlling this particular weed. So this is some, and I don't know why it got messed up. I guess because I switched from one computer to another, but there's a little label there in the middle. Let's move it out of the way while we're in here, if I can. There we go. So, well, it's not showing up there, is it? That's weird. Okay. So this is some data that was pulled from a little field trial that we're doing. We've got one location set up in College Station and one set up in Brenham, Texas. And we're looking at tracking soil moisture and soil temperature for the upper 2 inches of the soil profile, where we anticipate that the seeds are going to be most heavily concentrated. And then we go out and we count the number of individual POA plants that germinate in these 1 meter by 1 meter plots. So I actually have a grad student that goes out there and gets on his hands and knees and he counts, it can be well over 1,000 plants for each of these squares, and we have 8 at each location. So it's a lot of counting. And he looks at that and has plotted it against temperature and moisture so that we can kind of get a sense of how to better predict when we can anticipate POA germination. All of this will go towards trying to develop a predictive model, and we have other locations set up all throughout the country. One of the interesting things, if I go over here and look at the Brenham location, which is just a little bit further south, okay, we see that last year we actually had 2 distinct peaks of germination. So we had one in November, which is actually a little late for us, but we had a pretty hot, dry September, October. And then we had a second peak in January, almost late January, early February. And this is just in response to the climate conditions. And so what this means is, if I put out my pre-emergent pretty early, it might have helped me with this first peak, but that residual activity may have long worn off before I hit the second peak. And so this is again to emphasize the importance of potentially having a split or sequential application to help with control, especially if you are in parts of the state where we may not get quite as cold, or if we happen to have a year where we're not quite as cold. So if I'm down in Harris County where Paul is, I may choose to have a split or a sequential pre-emergent application when dealing with this particular weed. So if I'm trying to think about how to prevent resistance issues, let's say I'm a landscape professional or turf grass professional, or even in the case sometimes of our homeowners, it's still something to kind of think about and have in the back of your mind. The first is, of course, to implement an integrated weed management program. So we've talked about that a lot on Chat with Green Aggies before. We talk about integrated pest management and a number of AgriLife programs. This idea that relying on chemical control alone is a lot of times going to do more harm than good. We really want to take steps to have good cultural control, where we're maintaining, creating optimal conditions to maintain healthy, desired vegetation. We want to rely to some extent on mechanical control, which can include pulling weeds by hand. One thing that we're looking at in the big POA project that I'm on, this is something that my colleague colleagues Jim Brosnan and Brian Unruh are looking at in Tennessee and Florida is actually looking at a mechanical control practice called phrase mowing. And it's a very aggressive cultivation practice where they basically go in and they shave off the uppermost section of that soil profile, and you can kind of change the depth. So I can choose to go, ½ inch in depth, or I can go 2 inches in depth. And in doing that, I can remove the seed bank, the Poa seed bank that's accumulated in that system, and physically take it out. And provided I have a turf grass there, like Bermuda grass or zoysia grass that produces rhizomes, that turf species is able to recover from this cultural control practice. And then hopefully I've resolved a lot of my Poa issues by just physically taking that seed out of the system. We want to make sure that when we're designing a chemical control program that we're very cognizant of rotating the sites of action that we're using for our herbicide program between years and within seasons or within seasons. So again, when it comes to Poa, probably the two most common things that I'll see is that we tend to choose pre-emergent herbicides that fall just within this one group, which a lot of times is going to be group 3, which is microtubule assembly inhibitors. And so that's where you get your dimension, your pendulum, your barricade. All of those products fall within that one group, and they can be very effective products, but we want to find another pre-emergent with a different site of action to rotate in with those. And so that's something where we could use something like an indaziflam or spectacle and rotate that product in some way. And it also makes using spectacle a little bit more feasible because, spectacle can be a little pricier than some of these others. But if we're using it in a rotation and not using it all the time, it may open the door for us to have a little bit more flexibility there. Similarly, may see people rely on the same post-emergent products year after year because either they've had good experience with them or it's just cheap. It's cheap and it's easy for them to fit into their budget. But again, to the best of our ability, we want to ensure that we're rotating the modes of action. We're not getting too dependent on using that same product year after year because it can start to create some issues. And this extends, beyond a turf grass area and certainly into, let's say that I have areas that are mulched or have rock mulch or, some kind of pavement, and I'm using something like glyphosate to control the weeds, a non-selective herbicide to control weeds in that area. Well, Poa annua, we've seen develop resistance to that EPSP synthase inhibitor, which is that mode of action that we see in glyphosate. So we've seen it develop resistance to glyphosate or Roundup. And so even in those other areas, we want to rotate in other non-selective herbicides to help control this particular weed so that we don't end up accidentally creating a resistant population. We want to try to make sure that we design a program that uses both pre and post-emergence control options, reducing the number of plants that have to be controlled with post-emergent strategies. In general, we will see that it takes a little longer for us to see resistance in a pre-emergent to a pre-emergence herbicide. Doesn't mean that we won't see it, especially if we're overusing that product, but we may not see it develop quite as rapidly as with a post-emergence herbicide. So trying to use both in our program can be very helpful. This is a poster that was developed by my friend Jay McCurdy at Mississippi State University as part of this larger group project that we're on. And he did a really nice job, and I'll show you guys where you can download this here in a little bit. But basically what he did was he broke down all of the different products that are labeled for controlling POA by their site of action. And you can see they've got their WSSA group number right there. He has their chemical family within each of these groups, active ingredients, and examples of the trade names for some of those products. So here we have our ALS inhibitors. This is our largest herbicide group that we see. And we've got a number of different products in there that maybe you like to use when controlling POA. They all fall within this group too. Here's some of my pre-emergence herbicides in this microtubule assembly inhibitor group, group 3. There's my surfland, pendulum, barricade, dimension, curb. Okay, so all of those are going to fall into group 3. If I go down here, I've got my PS2 inhibitors, which are going to include my triazines, including atrazine and simazine, which are both under additional review by the EPA right now. So we may see some changes there in the years to come. We have a number of different things. So here's our glyphosate and our EPSP synthase inhibitor group 9. Here is another non-selective option, glufosinate, also called phenolate or cheetah. This is not going to have the systemic activity that glyphosate has, meaning that the product will not translocate throughout the plant. But in the case of an annual, we may still see some good efficacy in using this particular product if we're looking for a non-selective product, non-selective alternative to Roundup. So a lot of different options here. And again, I'll share the link with you so you can download this and kind of use it as a reference material if you're interested in that. So again, we want to make sure that we use labeled rates at appropriate timings and stages of growth. A lot of times treatments prior to tillering, when we just have that first little POA baby coming up, those are typically going to be the most susceptible to herbicides. We want to make sure that temperature and light conditions are conducive to active growth and herbicide uptake. A lot of times the product label will be very specific in terms of which temperatures that product tends to work best at. A lot of times we see something like, above 65 degrees Fahrenheit, below 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So somewhere in that range is the desired temperature range for controlling a lot of our weeds, and in the case of POA, it tends to be active during times of the year where we may not hit that range as often. So we may have to stay kind of alert to that. We want to scout populations after herbicide applications and avoid allowing those weeds to go to seed or proliferate vegetatively. So let's say that I do a broadcast herbicide application. I go out and I see that the majority of those weeds have been successfully controlled and are dead. But let's say I have that one little green guy that's still sitting there laughing at me. Well, I may want to go in and just go ahead and yank him out by hand because there's a chance that he is resistant, and I want to avoid that going to seed and spreading that resistance throughout my facility. We can use herbicides with different sites of action separately or in tank mixtures over the course of the same season. We do want to make sure that we can safely combine those products. Sometimes we see that when we combine 2 pesticide products, we can get a negative reaction, or in some cases we see reduced efficacy of the product where they don't work as effectively when they're combined with one another. So we want to make sure that we pay attention to the label there and only combine when the label tells us that it's okay for us to do that. And again, developing programs that include both pre and post-emergence herbicides. On that same poster, there's a nice overview of some of the pre-mixed products that are labeled for POA control that are out there on the market now. So you can kind of see how they combine different sites of action into these products in order to give you something that maybe will help prevent resistance from occurring. Now, this isn't foolproof because, again, we do see that some populations are perfectly capable of developing resistance to multiple sites of action at a time. So before I wrap up, I did want to share a little bit about this USDA. It's a specialty crops research initiative. And it's something where we're just looking at this one weed because it's become such a significant issue, particularly in managed turf systems. We're seeing pretty substantial economic losses as a function of this weed being a problem. So the USDA awarded us $5.7 million to address the annual bluegrass epidemic in turf grass systems and to look at how the level of resistance that we may be seeing across the country and ways that we can prevent and address that. We have 17 faculty involved from 14 different states. So you can kind of get a feel for that over here in this table, all of the different faculty that are working on this project. Texas A&M is the lead institution on this grant. My colleague Muthu Begavathianan wrote the grant and has been taking the lead on it. And we have 8 primary objectives for the work. So we look at everything from doing a field survey where we've actually collected, like I said, about 1,500 populations from all over the country. And a lot of these do tend to be very concentrated in the southern US because that's where we're really seeing this resistance be potentially an issue. And we're taking those populations, doing a preliminary screening to 9 different modes of action. In some states, they may be doing a few more than that, just depending on what they see in their particular region. And then depending on the level of potential resistance we see following that preliminary screening, those populations are then being looked at much more closely by some of the best turfgrass weed scientists in the country, to understand why is this resistance occurring, what is the extent of resistance that we're seeing, and then, you know, coupled with this, we're doing a lot of work to better understand this weed, to better get a sense of its biodiversity, of its physiological traits, to get a better sense of when, as you saw, when we may plan to see this germinate and emerge. We also have a number of studies looking at alternatives to chemical control. So mechanical control programs, how to modify fertility and irrigation programs to reduce pressure from Poa annua. So a lot of work going into this project. It's pretty cool. And we're just past the 2-year mark now. So we're going to start to see some publications coming out of this work pretty soon for the first couple of years worth of data that we've collected. And if you're interested in learning more about it, you can go to the website. It's resistpoa.org. And there you'll be able to download a copy of that Poa poster as well, if you're looking for a poster to keep with you for making chemical control decisions for this particular weed. We're also working pretty hard right now on a decision support tool, where a lot of that same information in the poster is being integrated into a very impressive spreadsheet that one of our postdocs is putting together. And ultimately that'll be used to help turfgrass managers make decisions for their particular facility, how to control this really challenging weed. So it's pretty exciting, a lot of great work, and you're welcome to contact me if you want to follow up or if you have more specific questions about it. I did want to, I'm going to pull something else up to talk about here in a second, but let's go ahead and do our plant of the week if we're ready for that.
Okay, let me bring that up here. Okay, so our plant of the week this week is probably the first perennial that made it as a Texas superstar. It is Texas Gold Columbine. It's an Aquilegia, Hinkleyana, and this is one that I really like to see. It lets you know that spring is around the corner. Now down here in the Houston area, I've seen this bloom as early as second week of February, and if we do have a cold winter, you know, probably the end of February, first week of March. So really just depends on how cold we get. But it does let you know that spring is around the corner. So this is one of the cool season perennials, early bloomer, and you can see, as with all Aquilegia, it's got that very distinct shooting star flower, the spurs coming off of it. Very, very prolific bloomer once established in the landscape. This was a found plant by Greg Grant, who's also a horticulture agent up in the Tyler area. What I find this plant does best, when we were over at Bear Creek, it was in an area where it would get full sun in the winter, and then it had the shade of a deciduous tree above it. So through the summer, it would maintain that foliage because it had that shade. If this was in direct sun in our summer heat, it would not fare very well during that time of year. And the foliage is kind of nice. It is kind of soft and airy. It's got a sort of a grayish green look to it. When it is in bloom, it's about 2 feet tall. When it's just in that vegetative state, probably about 16 to 18 inches in height. If you are in an area where you have deer problems, this is considered resistant. That doesn't mean that if the deer's hungry enough, they'll feed on it, but this is considered a deer resistant plant. On the production side, this is started from seed, so I would say, you know, probably a quart to 1 gallon tops. I think a quart would be an ideal size to grow this in. And on the landscape side, or if there's any gardeners out there, once this is established, this is easy to multiply by doing divisions. go in after bloom. You can go ahead and divide it up, and you can see how it fills in the area once established. So a great early season perennial, let you know that spring is just around the corner. And, it's one of those ones that comes back every year, very low maintenance. You may have to do a little bit of deadheading with it, but overall, great color and great flower production on it. Okay, I guess, Becky, if you've got something else that you want to bring up.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a couple little things before we finish. So the first is that I wanted to show you guys kind of an example of a herbicide label and how to look for how this product is classified by its site of action. So if I go, this is the dimension label that I have here. I'm not specifically condoning or encouraging the use of this product. It's just an example that I'm using. So this is a pre-emergent herbicide. And if I go down here, it says on the label, group 3 herbicide. Okay, so each herbicide will be assigned to a different group. I may have some others here that have multiple sites of action because they're combining multiple chemistries. And so they may list, multiple numbers here to reflect that. Also did want to share, Laura put the link in the chat, the Resist POA website you can find right here if you're interested in reading more about the project that I talked about today and getting access to some of those resources for POA annua control. Okay, so we have about 12 minutes left, technically, if we want to have some chitty chat at the end of our program today. I am going to put the link for our survey here in the chat if you don't mind taking a few minutes to fill that out for us. It's really helpful in helping us to continue to improve the program and measure how good of a job we're doing. So if you don't mind taking a few minutes and clicking on that. And if you guys watching have anything that you would like us to comment on or discuss, feel free to put that in the chat. So, Irfan, how does it feel to be done with your PhD after all these years?
It's a great relief. I think with any research project, especially one that your degree relies on, there's an extra amount of anxiety related to each research project that you do, every research experiment that you do. And it was getting particularly nerve-wracking when COVID hit, right? Because some of the work I was doing was actually scouting, grower greenhouses and releasing natural enemies and, counting whiteflies there and whatnot, and a decent amount of travel. And a lot of that was being tightened up. And so it is a great relief to be done and be able to focus a little bit more again on some of these projects, things like these webinars, and addressing some other key issues that our green industry folks are facing.
Yeah, that's awesome. It is a huge relief. It's also kind of weird because you dedicate years of your life to something, and then when it's over, it's just a bizarre feeling to know that that's done and that you don't have to keep working on it. And
yeah, like I don't even care about whiteflies anymore. That's not true. I think whiteflies are still a major issue. I guess fortunately, my PhD was very much tied into kind of my work objectives. And so, and at least I can on it, which is kind of nice.
Nice. Well, I'm not seeing any questions come through. I don't know if there's anything else that we need to discuss today, or Paul, do you have anything?
I am good on my end.
Okay, well, we're kind of a skeleton crew today, so don't have as many people to chime in. So, I do see Dr. Ong has joined us, though. So.
Yes, he has.
So, yeah, well, thank you guys so much for joining again. If you don't mind filling out that survey for us, we really appreciate it. What are we talking about next week?
Ooh, that's an exquisite question. Let's see if I can pull that up. Yeah, next week. Oh, next week is our chitty chat. that's probably why no one's asking any questions, because they're saving it up.
Saving them,
for
all those great juicy
next week.
questions.
Yes.
Yeah. Alrighty, sounds good. Well, thank you guys for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your week and a great weekend.
Take care.